Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Patreon podcast. This week I wanted to talk about the idea of learning how to program and why it's so very, very valuable. I could make some crazy claims like learning to program helped me fix my basement a couple weeks ago, or that it allows me to better understand how various systems within my office work, social and otherwise. And I want to dig into this a little bit because I think programming is a very distilled and very concentrated way of becoming familiar with systems and how to not only affect those systems, but view systems in a way that makes more sense. So going back to my basement. So a couple weeks ago, I was having issues with my basement where it was randomly flooding. Not a ton of water, but I would go into the laundry room and there was like a good centimeter of water on the ground. And then I had to mop it up and I didn't know where it was coming from. And the idea that I had was that it was from something like the washing machine or from the water softener or the water heater. And I didn't really know how to diagnose any of that stuff. And learning how to program allowed me to better understand which systems were at play and where the problem started to stem from. So it allowed me to essentially debug whether or not the washing machine was working, the clothes washer was working as expected, or if it was like spitting water out from the bottom, or if the water heater was like defective, it had cracked and it had started to leak. It allowed me to better understand all the systems that were at play, so I was able to better diagnose what was going on and how I could eventually fix it. In the end, it was unfortunately none of the things that I was able to diagnose, but it allowed me to get a better grasp of what was going on, so when I did bring somebody in, I was able to give them a very clean breakdown of the situation and that they could discover what was going on. What was happening was the water heater, there was a bunch of sediment in the bottom of it, and it was basically overpressurizing, and there was a pressure valve that I didn't see, and that pressure valve was basically breaking or opening every couple days, and it was flooding my basement with boiling water, which was pretty cool. But the idea that having a better grasp of these systems is so very important. And I think that learning how to program, it's not as daunting as you think, but it can really add value to your life. And what I can suggest is learning how to make really basic websites. And by programming, I'm not saying you need to write like the next big video game or that you need to write a huge app or anything like that. It's just writing out various systems that work inside of a computer and having them interact with each other. Whether that's having a box on a web page move around to follow your mouse, or if it's making a simple game in Unity, like making Pong or something like that. Both of those are completely valid options, and they'll give you a better idea of how to logically approach and solve problems. And that's really the crux, the main thing of programming is it allows you to logically approach and solve problems. Because like creativity and like any creative endeavor like writing music or painting or sculpting, what you do with programming is you're approaching a problem with a particular set of tools, and you need to understand how to solve it. And like creativity, programming has a ton of different ways to solve one problem. There's no singular correct answer when you're programming. And I think a lot of people think that programming is something that's either it's right or it's not. And while that's technically true, there's a lot of wiggle room in there where you can have the right answer. You can approach the right answer from myriad different ways. And it's important to find one that works the best, the one that's most efficient, or one that works for your style particularly. And I think that there's a lot of creativity that goes into programming, because you have to understand not only how the systems work, but you have to find a way to make them talk to each other, to make them communicate in a way that's not messy. And as far as systems, what I like to think about is like the systems of a car. So your steering wheel, the steering wheel of your car, doesn't care whether or not the headlights are on. But both of those are connected to the ignition. If the car's on, the steering wheel has power steering. And if the car's on, you want to make sure the headlights are on for safety. But if the ignition is off, you want to make sure the headlights are off so you don't drain the battery. You want to make sure the power steering isn't on, because that kind of drains the battery and it's not necessary. So having the steering system being connected to the ignition, and then not particularly associated, but the ignition is connected to all sorts of systems inside the car. And it's important to kind of understand how all of those work, because if for some reason, like the headlights stop working, you can pretty much guarantee that it's not related to the steering. So it's like the steering isn't related to the headlights, so that's probably not something that you need to diagnose when you're trying to, I say debug, but essentially just trying to figure out what's going on, why the headlights aren't working. You would probably go to the electrical system, which might be tied to the ignition or the battery or any of those things. You find associated systems with the problematic area of your overall system, like the car or your application. So yeah, I would highly recommend that you go and learn how to program. There's a ton of classes online, probably free classes on YouTube. If you wanted my suggestions, I would start with something like HTML, just basic HTML, and probably basic JavaScript, because both of those are very forgiving. They're very easy to get into, and there's a quick iteration cycle, because you can make JavaScript in Notepad or any kind of text editor. It doesn't really matter. And that will allow you to not only make a web page, which is satisfying in itself, to be able to write down a bunch of words and then open up Internet Explorer or Chrome or whatever, and have the thing that you wrote represented in a way by the computer that isn't how you wrote it, but it's like, so the background's blue and there's a box over there and all that other stuff. Like, it's really cool. It's really satisfying to be able to make something like that. So HTML and JavaScript is a great place to start. HTML is a language that allows you to structure the page. JavaScript is the language that allows you to move things around on the page. Both of them are pretty simple to understand. If you wanted to go a little bit more complex, I would highly recommend just downloading Unity, which is a game development software. But there's a lot that you can do with that. Unity, people use Unity to make AAA games. Hearthstone was made in Unity from Blizzard. But you can also use it to make very simple games like Pong. So you can sit down and understand how the computer takes input systems like the keyboard, and you can translate that input system into moving boxes around. And those boxes, in turn, can have some kind of a collision system, so the ball bounces off of them and not into the goal behind it. So I think that there's a lot that you can do with these systems, and to better understand how it all works and how they're related. And once you have a better understanding of these systems, it's a lot easier, or at least for me, it's been a lot easier for me to better understand how other systems work in the world, whether that's my car or my basement or whatever. It's really cool to be able to translate that stuff into reality a little bit more. So that's all I had with this one. I guess it went a little bit longer than usual, but I love programming, and I love telling people to learn how to program, just because there's a whole lot in there, and it's not as daunting as you think it is. When you think of programming, you think of like, well, probably not the movie Swordfish, because that was like in the 90s, but it's like this huge, complicated system that everybody has to struggle with. And it's like, no, programming can be very simple, and it can be fun if you're doing it in small scale. If you're doing large scale stuff, that's a whole nother that's a whole nother thing. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this one. I'm happy to answer any questions in the comments if I was a little confusing on this one, because it's a little bit more concrete, whereas my prior ones are more abstract. But this one's definitely something that I recommend you do. So again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for supporting me on Patreon. I really, really appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one. Be remarkable.